It's a pleasure to be here today. So, as Diane was saying, we've had a number of interactions, and it's a pleasure for me to come to talk to you today about myself. I feel humbled, and also some of my journey, and then also my journey with Newell. But before we get going, how many of you know what on earth Newell is? So, a few of you guys. Does anyone know what, like something that comes to mind when you say Newell? If you're actually talking about Newell, what do you think of when I say Newell? Or is there a product that comes to mind, or you put your hand up?
A lot of them, consumer packaged goods.
Yeah.
Strollers.
Baby strollers. Graco's one of them. Here, have some Sharpies. That's another one. So nice one. Anyone else? Any other products or any other things other than Sharpie? The Flair pens. You told me you liked those. So we met one once before. So you have, unfortunately I don't have any Flair pens today for you, but I do have some Sharpies. So yeah. Yeah, Flair is one of our popular brands actually, and I think that really summarizes Newell in the sense of Newell is one of those parent companies that no one really knows of. A few of you may know that Newell used to be known a short while ago as Newell Rubbermaid. And normally if I explain that to someone, they're like, oh, Rubbermaid, I know that. That's, Tupperware, they'll say, and we'll quake in our boots because Tupperware is actually a competitor. So, but Newell is one of those parent companies that over the years has grown into a number of different brands. And today I would like to talk to you about some of my journey and how I got there, and then also some of the journey that Newell is actually going on. So hence the new Newell. So basically this is what I'm going to talk about. A little bit about me, not to spend too much time on that, but I am an engineer, so I figured, we're all on that journey. We all have some connections, with that, and other areas as well that I've worked on in terms of design and things like that. I'll talk a little bit about my inspiration. I often think, well, how on earth did I get on this journey? I think when I set out years ago, I didn't actually say, yes, I will be an engineer one day, or I will do this one day, or I'll end up in Newell. So I want to talk to you a bit about that. So my inspiration, my journey, where I've come to. I've worked in the United States for about 16 years now. And prior to that, I was not in the United States, as you may have guessed from the accent. Then I'll also talk a bit about the Newell journey. And at the end of it, there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. So if you have anything as we go. So this is me. Again, as Diane was saying, the people at the Design Center do look very happy. This was actually on day one at the Design Center. I started with Newell 3 years ago, and prior to that I didn't work for Newell. So it was quite a leap of faith for me to up sticks from the Chicago area and move my whole family to beautiful Kalamazoo, which is where we're based. And it was a journey that at first the big question was why Kalamazoo, what's Newell, all that. But once we got beyond that, we realized they were onto quite a good thing. And by bringing together a lot of people in one space, creative people, engineers, usability, different disciplines. There's a lot of creative energy, and you can do some great things with that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I am the studio engineering manager, and a lot of you might think, what on earth is that? That's almost as mysterious as what Newell is. So, but a studio engineering manager, engineering is my background, and I spent the past 15 or so years in product development, working on a whole range of things, and we'll look at those in a moment. But the studio engineer works right at the early stages of the product development process, and that is really, when you're ideating, when you're exploring many different ideas. We have a team of industrial designers that are exploring a lot of different things, but they do need inputs from engineers. They might want to get through certain technical challenges, like how do I make this door on a printer open and close successfully? Or we were talking today a lot about the perception of luxury or quality or whatever that product is supposed to instill in the end user, and who is it supposed to resonate with. We have to make sure that product really delivers. And anything that's been promised through advertising or some other sort of promise before that person buys it, we really have to make sure the product delivers, otherwise people will be disappointed. So the studio engineering team, and I'm one of 4 based in Kalamazoo, and 4 team members, and we support the industrial designers with that early stages of product development. My origins, though, and we'll go into those in a moment, are actually in manufacturing, so I've sort of experienced a bunch of different areas of the product development process. So as you may have gathered from my accent, I am not a native from Kalamazoo, Michigan, Chicago, spent a bit of time in California, but I grew up in England, and spent the first part of my career in the UK working in manufacturing, and working for an engineering company that gave me the opportunity to come over to the United States for a 6-month rotation. And so here I am 16 years later. So I do like the place, so as you probably gathered. A little bit about my inspiration. Going way back to, I have two boys actually, 10 and 7 years old. And my 10-year-old is sort of going through the phase that I was going through, I think, when I started my first inclinations of is engineering a career for me, even though I had no idea what engineering was or what a career was for that matter at that age. But one of my inspirations behind it was this chap called William Heath Robinson, and he was an artist from the 1940s in England, and he would do a lot of little sketches and illustrations around contraptions, I suppose would be one way of calling these things. The American equivalent, I think, is Rube Goldberg. I think the Rube Goldberg contraptions would be sort of on a parallel. So he was one of my inspirations. I remember as a 10-year-old saving up some money to buy a book of his collection of his best illustrations, and this was one of them. And although they're very whimsical and farcical, this one's for testing golf clubs. And the idea being that each one, the guy on the top right cuts the cord, the spring forces the rope round, it whacks the golf club on the ball, which hits the bellows, blows the turbine, and depending on how fast it blows, that's roughly equatable to how many yards this golf ball might fly on a fairway. Kind of ridiculous, but the thing I always liked about his drawings is you could follow them through and they were well thought out. Nothing was left nothing was levitating, it was all sort of connected and you could definitely work it out. And I think that's what sparked my interest, potentially in engineering. One of the other people that I really like, I wasn't just reading books, I was looking at television, and there was this television program called The Secret Life of Machines. This is going to make me sound extremely nerdy, it's not the intent. But in England, there's this guy called Tim Hunkin, and I have an image of him. This was one of his clocks, actually. Can anyone tell me where that is? It's somewhere in England, I'll give you a clue. It's nothing famous, it's not Big Ben, it's not... But does anyone recognize it? I thought it might be a long shot, but it's actually Covent Garden, which is a nice area of London. If you ever get a chance to go over to London, it's a very vibrant sort of London borough. And it's there's this area called Neal's Yard in there, which is it's really had an upsurgence in recent years, and it's quite a cool place to go. This is one of his clocks. He would build these he's an engineer, mechanical engineer, went to Cambridge, and built, he calls himself an aquatic horologist, meaning water clocks, I think, in a nutshell. And again, like the William Heath Robinson, these clocks tend to be more contraptions than useful timepieces. But again, I think the engineering of them and the stuff that goes into it, really interests me. So here he is. Tim Hunkin is his name. And I actually was thinking about this. I love taking things apart. I pulled my parents' television set apart when I was young to wire it up to the amplifier when they were out shopping, because I knew they wouldn't care for me to be doing that with their permission. And by the time they came back, I'd have it all rigged up. And this is one of my inspirations. This guy, I think of him as one of the original makers. It's kind of in vogue right now to be a maker, an experiment, and there are a lot of benefits to that, and I do encourage you all to do that. We learn so much from sort of learning with our hands and actually experimenting, in 3D. But I think of him as one of the original makers. He would come up with these very unusual contraptions, like the one in the background there, which is, who knows what it is? I think it's something that's supposed to emulate sort of how photons colliding in a sort of arcade machine coming together, which is kind of an unusual sort of project. But the image on the left was actually him experimenting with, or showing us through the Secret Life of Machines, how light bulbs worked. And he was passed a high current through this filament to show that it glows, and some of the early experiments from Swan and Edison, in terms of light bulbs. He would sort of really bring those to life, and again, that really sparked my interest. So who knows, I don't know if I decided there and then that engineering is for me, but that was some of my journey. So back in 1999, I made the choice to come over to the States. I was lucky enough to be offered, after graduating from university, lucky enough to be offered a position in a company that had a rotation scheme. So I got to experiment with a number of different areas of engineering. And one of those was over here in the States. So that was my path over to the States, and I love it so much, I've stayed ever since. So my origins, I'm afraid I'm not a Michigan graduate, I'm sorry, but I love it here, so maybe vicariously through Melissa and other colleagues that did graduate from the University of Michigan. I feel very much at home here, and a lot of it actually resonates with the university I went to. This, Durham University in England, so up in the northeast of England. And this is not, contrary to belief, this is not actually Hogwarts or something from a Harry Potter movie. This is actually the place where we graduated, which is part of the University College. It's split up into colleges at Durham. And the University College is one of the oldest actual, not older than Oxford and Cambridge, but it's one of the oldest university buildings, believe it or not, because it dates back over 900 years, which is insane. The good news is the engineering department was significantly more up to date than that. And so we had a lot of more modern resources to hand. After that, as I said, I actually started out on a rotation scheme. I definitely encourage you all to, and I know some of the people here today have actually applied for internships with Newell. I definitely encourage you to do that. Get as much sort of real-world experience with companies. There's a lot of good companies out there willing to connect with you guys. There's such a wealth of knowledge and research going on here that I think it behooves those companies and you as individuals on your career path to really connect. And I did that. So I started off with a company called IMI. They're involved in a whole load of engineering things. I started out in manufacturing. So I was designing machines that made the things. So my origins are not in product development, which is where I am today. But that's actually me back in the day. I found an old archive picture of me posing rather awkwardly by me on the left there, wearing the tie. In England, we used to have to wear ties all the time, even in manufacturing locations, which I think is sort of a bit scary today because you could easily get tangled up in one of the machines. So somehow I managed to survive, though. Maybe that was the test. But we worked on a lot of real heavy industry products. The company made big, large mechanical systems for power stations. The things on the left are actually pneumatic actuators. And Diane was mentioning about the different motion systems that you work on here at the university. So a lot of my origins are in those systems, specifically pneumatics. This sort of close-up on the right, forgive me, is actually the inside of also a valve system that we worked on, which was a technology known as drag valves. And it was for, so a separate industry from the pneumatics, but another project that I worked on in manufacturing whereby you can control severe service valves, they call them. So controlling rapid sort of pressure drops on nuclear power stations and also oil and gas refineries and such. And the technology is interesting because normally when you've got fluid flow, you actually wanted to go through the least obstructed path possible so you don't get losses. We all know about those sort of things. The interesting technology behind this is you want to actually give it such a tortured path as the gases or the liquids go through the system that you actually slow everything down, you get massive pressure drops and so on. And by having laminations, you can control that flow depending on how much the valve is open or closed. That company enjoyed the patent to that for a long time, so they reap the rewards. I think it's open now for anyone to use. So, but yeah, that was kind of interesting industry to be in. After that, I had the opportunity, staying with the same company. Being British, I am a fan of tea, you probably gathered. So I actually got a chance to work on a cool project for Lipton, and this was the Pepsi-Lipton partnership. So I moved away from more of the heavy industry at this point and was now in Chicago. And this really sparked my interest for product development that interacts with consumers. Suddenly I was moving away from large-scale valves where it was all about the engineering robustness to suddenly there's a lot of engineering that goes on inside one of these urns, for example, which is doing a lot of blending of tea concentrate, natural tea concentrate, but with water, so you get fresh batch sort of tea brew right there on demand. But the interactions that humans, consumers, you and I, when we go to a restaurant or a store, the sort of interactions, the things that are beyond just it working well, it was the sort of the interaction of how you resonate with the customer, how you actually get the customer to use a product. When they use it, does it reinforce the quality that you're trying to portray with that beverage, for example? And so we worked on a bunch of projects with that, and that really sparked my interest for consumer products. And really, the way it's, the mindset, it's you have to pick from various areas, like engineering, from marketing requests, from all these different facets, and make sure all those components align for a successful product. And so that was really the start of my transition to actual products. I then moved companies to work for Bosch doing power tools, and these were actually two of the products that I worked on. The Dremel Trio, it was Dremel and Rotozip were the two brands that I worked on, and I'm an avid home enthusiast, DIY enthusiast we call it, do-it-yourself home improvement enthusiast. So to work for a company that you make the power tools that then I go and use at home, it seemed like the dream job. So, I worked on that for a bunch of years, and that taught me a lot about doing observation and user research. So I was lucky enough today to go to various usability labs that you have here at the university and see a lot of that stuff. And it really resonates with me because you not only, at the end of the day, we're designing for the end user. If they don't like our products, then they will go somewhere else, or they'll not use it, or you'll get bad reviews on Amazon, and that will be it. So we have to do things that make people's lives easier and better. And I really got to tune with that at Bosch when I did Power Tools. So I did that for about 3 years. But enough about all that. I really came to talk to you today a little bit more about what's happening at Newell and the journey that Newell is going on. So it's not just my journey of discovery on engineering, and every day is a new discovery, but just what's going on at Newell. So Newell Brands, as it's known now, was Newell Rubbermaid. We recently purchased a company called Jarden, again, a mystery name for a company, but they own a lot of brands that people know, like Mr. Coffee and Oster and Coleman camping gear and stuff like that. So there's a colossal collection of brands with a lot of variety. And so I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of those and what we're up to at Newell. So, from humble beginnings, well, it doesn't look that humble. That looks like kind of an impressive building there. 1903 is when Newell started, and it was in New York State, actually upstate New York. And can anyone guess what the first product Newell was responsible for? Does anyone know? Have a guess. Is anything? It's not. Sorry?
Wells.
It wasn't Wells, but that's a good guess. It was about as exciting as Wells. I'll give you some pens because of that. There you go. There's some Sharpies, and there'll be plenty more left at the end, so people can come and get Sharpies afterwards. So it wasn't Wells. It was maybe not quite as exciting as Wells. It was actually metal curtain rods. So at some point, someone decided that we all need metal curtain rods. The interesting thing about that building, it's not actually their original headquarters building in New York State. It's actually the Freeport, Illinois building, which was of a similar vintage, and we still have an office in there today. So it's kind of interesting that there's some heritage. Even though I think of Newell as quite a progressive company, it's interesting that we actually have an office still in that original building, which is kind of nice. But anyway, coming a little closer to where we are today, I'm actually based in the Kalamazoo office, and this is a nice picture of it. No Photoshop there. That actually was a double rainbow over the office, which is kind of insane. Maybe it's a sign. I mean, we've done quite well. The building is actually a really nice building, but this is now where the design center is. So Newell, and I'll talk through this in a moment, but Newell actually made a decision a number of years ago to really pull together some of their strengths. Rather than having a few industrial designers, say, in Chicago doing pens, and a few industrial designers and engineers in North Carolina doing sort of tools or Rubbermaid commercial products, they decided to pull a lot of that together. So they decided to come to Michigan, and there's one of the main reasons for that is there is a lot of design talent here in Michigan. What with automotive, furniture industry, all the medical industry and such that's out on southwest Michigan, near where we are. It was definitely a good place to come for that resource. So they decided, let's do this. Brought in as many people that they could from Newell, but there wasn't that many already, so they built the team up. So it's a significantly increased team recently. About 130, 140 people there right now in the building. So it's kind of a vibrant community going on there. Some of the stats in terms of the countries we served, they got sales offices in a bunch of different countries, about 125, and the revenues are very sizable. So one of the interests about the company is although it is a big company with sizable revenue, it feels very entrepreneurial to me, and we're empowered to make a lot of decisions and choices ourselves without having to go through a lot of red tape or bureaucracy. If it's something that the team decides will really help the company, then you're empowered to actually do something about that, which is fantastic. This is actually a view inside. So you may have noticed that picture with the beautiful rainbows. That was about the most interesting thing about the exterior of our building. That Mother Nature blessed us with rainbows on that day. It's a very nondescript sort of box, really, from the outside, but it was custom made for us. And then once you get inside, this is the view through the front door. They did a fantastic job. Diane's had the opportunity to come there, and I do invite, if any of you are ever out that way, feel free to reach out to us. You're more than welcome to come and see what we're all about. But they did a fantastic job of making it very light, bright, inspiring space, very sort of almost Scandinavian influences inside, but definitely a fantastic place to work. One of the nicest places I've ever worked, so I feel lucky to be there. These are some of the brands that we actually work on, which are part of Newell. So suddenly it becomes a little clearer what on earth Newell is all about. You may recognize some of those, of course. Top left, Sharpie. I gave you a hint by giving away some Sharpies there. But a lot of them are brands that are very recognizable by consumers. So you've got a lot to uphold. A lot of these names, if we take a misstep and actually come up with a product that doesn't really resonate with the consumer, you can really do some damage to a well-known brand. I mean, Sharpie is like the Kleenex of pens, isn't it? I mean, people will ask for a Sharpie even if they don't actually want a Sharpie. So yeah, there's quite a few interesting ones there. We can talk a little bit more about those at the end if anyone has any specific questions about that. In terms of locations, these are really the R&D locations, so there's quite a few of them. And when I say R&D, I'm talking about not just industrial design, but also usability, model shops, engineering, of course, manufacturing, and a lot of those sort of teams and departments that go into making these products. The good news is a lot of them are actually made right here in the United States as well. The Sharpie is a good example. They're made in Tennessee, so you know, you can get in a car and go and see these in production, not have to get on a plane, for example, which when we're developing products is a huge plus because you can actually go and spend time with the teams without having to take a 2-week sort of chunk of time and have that closer to home, not necessarily right on our doorstep, which would be ideal, but closer to home. Now this is a little bit about the structure of Newell, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the structure of companies, but it tends to ebb and flow and really depends on the business model that they've chosen to adopt. Newell used to be a holding company, and can anyone tell me what on earth a holding company is? Does anyone have any idea what that would be? Just hold lots of things. In a nutshell, it's actually a company that does just hold lots of things. It's a central entity that just buys companies over time, maybe develops them a little bit, but leaves them to their own devices. And there are pluses to that and there are negatives to that. The biggest plus, I suppose, is that that company, in this case, here's some of the examples of the companies that were the holding companies. So if we go to Dymo label printers, they might be left to their own devices in terms of deciding what they want to do in terms of product development or how much money they want to plow into advertising or research, or they're left to those own devices. And as you can imagine, a printer has quite different constraints from, say, a fountain pen up there in the top left. Very different user, very different market. The fountain pens in the top left, some of those are quite high-end, and the intent, a lot of them are gifted, and because they're high-dollar item pens. So not everyone uses a fountain pen every day anymore, but you know, as a gift or a commemorative thing, or for signing, you know, important documents, you know, definitely quite something. The idea behind this, though, is that each company. The downside of this is that each company doesn't necessarily have the might of the overall company. So it's the whole synergy thing of bringing those together. So I want to say about 5 years ago, Newell actually made the transition to go to an operating company model, which, as you imagine, is easier said than done. The idea behind that is bring together and centralize some of those activities. For example, the industrial designers in Kalamazoo. The Kalamazoo office wouldn't be there today if they hadn't have decided to go to this operating company model. And by bringing those teams together, you suddenly have so much more voice. You know, the designers, the engineers. You know, and when I say together, I'm talking the industrial designers for Sharpie are sitting just alongside the industrial designers for the Graco baby strollers, and the Rubmate commercial garbage can designers are right next door. You know, they're all there, and so you can share a lot of ideas. And suddenly, instead of having 3 designers in one location and 3 in another, without much resource behind them or much say at the table, suddenly you've got 45, and the voice of them and the sharing of ideas, it's so much more. So there's a huge benefit there. We didn't bring everyone to Kalamazoo, though. There are more than 130, 140 people in Newell. And so a lot of those people are still in other areas, but they brought those centers of excellence together. So marketing sort of seemed to converge in Atlanta. Engineering has a couple of sites, North Carolina and then also Atlanta. And then the pens, there's a significant engineering contingency in the Chicago suburbs. We're also building resources in Chicago as well. So I would say there's about 4 or 5 sort of hubs or centers of excellence for these different things. But by bringing those people together, you can share ideas, and you're not just working on pens all the time. You can flex over to different teams. And by sharing those ideas, we find people in different segments or business units can often bring some fantastic things to the table that another team that's always been working on pens, for example, wouldn't necessarily have seen had they not cross-pollinated ideas. So there's a lot of advantages. These are some of the ones that they brought together. Industrial design, of course, I mentioned. And when we're talking industrial design, we're talking, some of you guys, I believe, know, some of you are, I think, do have some industrial design background. But it might be the person that designs the aesthetic, the touch points, the interaction. then the engineering team, of course, will take all that detail. If you're talking about a pen, it might be the industrial designer might say, well, it has to make a nice audible click to make sure that I know there's a positive interaction happen there, and usability will advise on that. But the engineer might then take that detail and have to make that happen. And how will we do that? How do we make this pen sound right? And that really resonates with some of the stuff in terms of the perceived luxury or perceived quality on some of the products that we're striving for. Some of the other teams that I brought together, Model Shop, that's an important one, really to support our designs. And we're not just talking a highly refined model of a pen before you produce it. We're talking maybe early functional prototypes. And the idea behind that is you really want to learn quickly. You hear people say the phrase, if you're going to fail, fail fast and fail often and get that out of the way so you can carry on with the journey. But there is a lot to be said with that. If you're going to develop something, there is a time and a place for CAD, and really nailing the design is absolutely critical. But sometimes in the early stages of product development, you really want to be working on that sort of prototyping quite early on. So by bringing the teams together, we ended up with this structure, which we call the plaid structure. And it's really, what you're doing is you're bringing together the different functions, so engineering, industrial design, marketing, all along the horizontal, and then the different divisions like Graco, strollers, the teams for the pens, Sharpie, different divisions like that, Rubbermaid commercial products, and so on. And by sharing those and cross-pollinating those ideas, that really is that sort of centralized sort of structure that we've sort of gone for. So it is a huge undertaking, though, because as you can imagine, a lot of the infrastructure in a company was dependent on what that company was in its own right. Sanford and Sharpie and Graco, they were all companies in their own right, not just brands at one point. Now they are brands of Newell, but they are still, there's a lot of equity in that, and what you find is that some of these brands were using, say, SolidWorks for their design software, and another brand's using Pro-E or Creo. And so trying to harmonize that and bring that together is no small feat. So there are growing pains with such an endeavor, as you can imagine. Some of the advantages, though, of course, as I said, each department has a much greater voice. So you're not dealing with just two people in a room somewhere that never really get heard. Suddenly there's more substance to design, and it's recognized from a corporate level right up to the top. Same with engineering, same with marketing, and so on. Each division has access to more resource. We found with the Kalamazoo Design Center, we have a nice model shop there, so we can actually do 3D printing and prototyping, and there's 3 model makers that work there all the time, and we're always in there from an engineering standpoint. We have our tinkering space in the back, and we wouldn't have had that if we were at some of the other sites. I'm rather jealous. I've seen some of the labs here today. You have fantastic resource here, so which is superb. And in companies, that's sometimes hard to come by unless the company is really investing in a lot of energy. Good news for universities, because then companies choose to come to university to invest, which is fantastic. But it's nice that we do have some of that resource, at least in Kalamazoo and the rest of Newell. The cross-pollination of ideas I mentioned, not only do we have those structured conversations where you might actually be having a brainstorming session with cross-functional people from completely different teams, but you might just have those casual corridor conversations, literally the water cooler type conversation where you're discussing something about something new that you've seen and it sparks an idea with someone else. And the space has actually been designed specifically to foster that sort of interaction. There's a lot of little isolated, or not isolated, but little meeting areas where you can just sort of stop, pause, exchange conversation. And I find at first you might think, wow, won't that just foster people chatting about the game on the weekend or something like that? The funny thing is it really does foster a lot of creative conversation. A lot of people at the Design Center, at least, and that's my experience, is they're very passionate about what they do. And those ideas just come out. I think half of us would probably do our job as a hobby. The fact that we get paid for it is kind of cool as well. The other thing, I'll just pick on some elements that I think help us. It's not an exclusively all-encompassing list, but some of the things that I feel are very important for good product development. One of them is a strong process, and this isn't really, you're not meant to be able to read the detail here. That's not really the important part. The important part is that a company has a process that is a path. You don't want to constrain product development too much in the sense of too much process and can really lead you down the same avenue each time. But you need a certain amount of structure to really help you go down that path. Otherwise, you find you start to meander this way, and then you talk with another team, you go that way, and I have actually worked for companies where things seem to be in an eternal product development cycle, which maybe if it's an exploratory research side where you're learning and new things will be gleaned from that, new products will be born from that research. But if you have a clear path and you want to launch a product by a certain time, you can't afford to typically go on that meandering path. There'll always be room for divergence where you're exploring lots of ideas, so it's not all about one idea. But you want to do that early on in the process. The way we break it up is we have the early stages where we're doing visual design brief, where you're clearly setting out the goal, like where are we going, where do we want to go. Then you might do the architectural review, the AR, and that's where you, for a lot of our products, there's whole families. So you might get a whole range of garbage cans or a whole different types of stroller that might be based on the same platform that have different things depending on different markets or different trim levels. For some people want the super deluxe one, other people just want the functional one that's going to be reliable. So you start to map out that architecture, that product architecture. And by doing that foundation early on, it really helps you on that journey later. It's like anything, like the saying, to fail to plan is to plan to fail. So you really want that plan to be sort of quite rock solid up at the beginning. All the other stages, these other things, these IDR, that's an industrial design review, it's just key milestones so that you have your checks and balance. And in those early stages, it's all about divergence, exploring lots of different concepts. And we were talking earlier, it's really about sometimes taking a step back and challenging maybe the design brief, which originates from the marketing team, and saying, is this really what the customer wants? Is this really the problem we're trying to solve? So taking a step back, making sure we are solving the right problem, because we could spend a lot of time solving the wrong problem, and the last thing you want to do is discover that it's the wrong product when it's on shelf and no one's buying it. That's a very expensive way to discover it's not the right product. So we do a lot of those things in terms of the different design review steps. They're really an opportunity for everyone to pause and take stock. Are we still doing the right thing? The other thing I really want to highlight here is it's important not to have one team go through a certain stages of a process and have industrial design, let's say, work on something, get it to a point where they've diverged, converged, and they say, here's our perfect design. And then engineering takes it and says, well, there's no way we can fit everything inside that design, or you've got to change this and this. And sometimes it's a very small change if you do it that way, but it's a massive change for an industrial designer to totally change the dynamic of the product. So the important thing there, the one takeaway I've learned from this over the years is get everyone involved early on. And sometimes it's not always, might not sound productive to have everyone involved at the beginning. The chart on the bottom actually shows blue for engineering, black for industrial design, and I just plucked out the industrial design engineering component here. Obviously, in developing a product, you have purchasing people, you have marketing, you have this distribution team. You've got so many people that have to come together to make a product get out the door from a dream through to reality. But just taking industrial design and engineering, really the industrial design portion in terms of time spent is represented by the black line, and the blue line here is engineering. So as you can see, as you go further down the process, the engineers are much more heavily involved. At the beginning, it's much more the industrial design. The good news is it is neither one nor the other. There is always a certain element of both, and that's a key thing. The other thing I always recommend is when you get those players involved at an early stage in the product development, make sure they have some skin in the game. And by that I mean don't just invite them to the meeting and they sit there and they nod and they say, yeah, we can make that, and I've got my mind on 6 other things, see you later. Sure, they were at the meeting, but was that useful? Not really. And as a result of that, we've actually adopted this modification in the process. We now have a TA, which is a technical assessment, and that is actually a stage earlier on in the process, which is actually run by engineering. And the critical thing there is they have to present, they have to analyze, they have to really vet what the industrial design is in the direction of where they're going. And the beauty of that is they'll start looking at some of that detail, and then they can steer and say, okay, well, now we're coming down to maybe 2 or 3 concepts. These are the elements that have to change. And as a result, then the industrial designer can sort of, I suppose, for want of a better word, put the icing on the cake, and then sort of everyone's on the same page. So by the time you get to these later design reviews and these technical reviews with engineering, it's more a path of implementation, which is, in an ideal world, guarantees you success. The reality, there's always curveballs that will come into projects, changes in sort of restrictions or things that you can include in a pen in terms of ink formulations, or, you have to be ready. Another thing that I've always been taught is you have to be quite adaptive. The only thing that's constant often is change. And so as you go down this process, which can last for a couple of years sometimes, from that original dream through to a product being on shelf, can be a couple of years. Even in consumer products where you might think, oh my goodness, isn't that every month you're coming up with something new? Well, you might be coming up with new ideas every month, but the reality is to tool a pen, you're talking millions of dollars and probably 18 months or 6 months in tooling sometimes for the production equipment that makes a pen, you might be talking 18 months for something like that. So often that's the longest constraint. So if you're going to change something, you need to make sure you're doing the right thing before it goes out there. So process, I would say that's a very important part. Customer research. Now this is actually, Melissa might recognize this style. It's not actually our research lab that we have, but an image that suggests that. I didn't actually have one of our research lab. I should have asked you. Well, the only one I had actually had some products that aren't released yet, so I'm probably not supposed to show those. However, this is actually a very similar setup to ours. And I know you guys here have, there's a lot of great facilities here. We actually were taken through a new lab that's in the process of being made, where you can also simulate the interior of houses and such. And Melissa and her team on the usability side actually run this lab, and it's based in Kalamazoo. So the fantastic thing about that is we can see firsthand people using our products. The idea is that the person in the room on the far side would be interacting with something or using a product, using a pen, trying to use a mop bucket that we make or something like that. You configure the room in any way that sort of really helps test the product. And then from this side, you're looking through a one-way mirror. So the participants on the other side, maybe contestants if it's something fantastic. They can't see the people. They're aware that there's people observing them because you have to let them know, of course. But they're not distracted by them is the intent. And so you can actually see what people do. One of the biggest things I've learned is this is a good component. There are a lot of other components to really getting insights into product development. And that whole, I call it like casual observation. You might ask someone like, what do you like about your Sharpie pen? And they might say it's fantastic. And when you see them using it, you realize, wow, that seems really challenging. They're doing something that seems awkward. But they would never have told you that because they just sort of learn to live with it. You especially find that with people who are professionals in certain trades where they're proud to have mastered the art of mopping the floor, drilling something, drywalling, various trades like that where there's a lot of skill involved. And often in those areas, people will often say that so if you ask someone for feedback, they'll often give you feedback that everything's actually okay. The best way I often find is the casual observation where someone may be using a product of yours and you sort of observe challenges. It's not the only way, it's one component of the whole design process, but you might observe them struggling with something, and through what we can bring to the table as engineers, designers, and people in research, we can actually sort of take that and think, well, we can make that better, make that easier. And through that, by having products which are easier to use, that's going to help the product be more successful. I'm not sure what they're doing on this, but anyway, it looks kind of, something's going on. So the other really big one, which I think is kind of important, is allowing yourself enough time to get in the flow. It's all too easy today in sort of the corporate world to get so bogged down with endless meetings, endless distractions, there's always someone pulling on my sleeve, that it's very difficult to really sort of get into the flow and do the work that we can do best, the design work, the planning, the actual work that's going to push projects forward. And one of the things that I'm really proud of at Newell, especially Nate Young, who actually is responsible for the whole design center at Newell. One of the big things that he put in place was to make sure we had enough space to get in the flow, as he calls it. And by that we mean whether you put on your headphones or you find a space, or you can have a clear day, hours, whatever it takes to really make progress on your designs. It's the concept of if you get an interruption, it takes significantly longer to get back in that flow. So how do we enable people to really do their work? Which is refreshing, because I think today in the whole world where we're always being sort of pinged by our phones, or there's someone after this or that, it's all too easy to suddenly get to the end of the day and think, what did I do today? I was busy all day. I don't think I achieved anything on my project. So the beauty is that I would encourage you guys to make sure you have that time to get into flow. And we do a lot of industrial design. These aren't actually our products, but we do a lot of work on industrial designs with sort of doing early critiques and ideation sessions where it's very critical to get into that flow. If you break that flow, and the best way to do that sometimes is to put the computers aside and actually just sort of work as a team in a room in a collaborative space. So I'm thankful that we can actually do that at the design center. It's very cool. The other one is prototyping. This is kind of an odd-looking prototype. Can anyone tell me what they think that prototype is for? It's not actually a Newell prototype, even though the pen used on the top is actually a Newell Expo pen. Wait, what do you think it is? A drill. That is actually a good answer. I was hoping people wouldn't get nervous and think it was actually an early prototype for a firearm or something, because that wasn't the intent. Will you pass some of those pens across to you? Thanks. Yeah, my intent was it was just a very rudimentary prototype, and I was kind of excited to find this one because it's actually using some of our products. Again, you see our products in the most obscure places. This is, I think, is a good example. But yes, it was a prototype for a surgical implement for use in operations. I think it was like a drilling. It was a very basic ergonomics. Someone was trying to describe this is what I'm looking for, and I think they just looked around and grabbed the dry erase marker off the whiteboard and started taping everything together. The thing I wanted to illustrate by this was the importance of prototyping and prototyping early. I'm a strong believer in those string and tape sort of prototypes that just prove out a concept. We achieve a lot actually at the Design Center, not just doing fully baked prototypes where you've designed CAD, you 3D printed, and you've gone on that journey. You do need those as well, and we do a lot of those further downstream. But I would say don't be afraid to do a lot of this upstream. I think if companies are progressive enough, they will be on board with this sort of thing in those early learning early stages of the product development. And I was actually encouraged in the room upstairs where Diane took us earlier today. I actually saw a bunch of these to do with the coffee machines and things like that, and I was like, brilliant, that's great to see. So, the other real plus is that is a good thing at Newell is that they've actually empowered us to make change, which is fantastic. Often as you get into a big company, sometimes it gets quite bureaucratic and you suddenly feel, well, I'd love to make change, but I have to go through this, climb a mountain to do anything, and that can be frustrating. So there's a lot of companies out there that maybe that is the way, but we can, at Newell actually, we have the opportunity to be the change we want to be. And this was just an example of an exercise we did recently just about our space. We had the opportunity to expand our space. As the company's grown, we've already outgrown our space, which is hard to believe. So we had the opportunity to expand the space, and the guy that runs the center, Nate Young, he actually gave us the responsibility to sort of collect all the data from the team as to what would you want to do in that space, which I find very interesting because I have a number of passion projects like that, where you can almost think of your working space and your working environment like you would a product. And we all have to use it, we have to interact with it, just like we have to interact with a Sharpie. So how do we make that space workable for us? And I think it's great that we got to do that. This data is being collated and actually fed back to the architects for creating the new space. So it's kind of cool. So, I would encourage you guys, you'll see a lot of things that you can change in the world in terms of a product or something you're working on, but sometimes it's beyond that, and the things that you do to change your working space can help in a fantastic way as well. This really sort of summarizes it. This is one of my favorite quotes. Of course, most of you have probably heard of this. Mahatma Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. And I think not every company enables that, but I think Newell, I believe Newell, at least at the Design Center, will allow us to do that. You'd think with a big bureaucratic company, it would just be tough to do, but the entrepreneurial spirit is there, and you can actually make the difference. And I know there are a lot of other companies out there like that too, Google, others that come to mind, but I think Newell might be one of those unsung ones. Another thing that really resonates with me is this was a pen that I worked on. This was, Melissa will recognize these from the writing team. This is actually the new Papermate Inkjoy gel pen. The fantastic thing about this is actually an engineering thing. The ink will not smudge or dries a lot more quickly than any of the competition. Gel pens, I didn't know what a gel pen was, even though I like drawing before I came to Newell. But a gel pen is a very inky pen, as far as I'm, for want of a better way of describing it. And a really nice, bright, inky pen. And the challenge with that is, though, when you have a lot of ink deposited on the paper, it actually tends to smudge very easily. So a challenge for people left-handed, or if someone wants to highlight very quickly, or even if you just want to get on your way and you've smudged your work. So there was a big engineering challenge to formulate a new ink which actually would be dry more quickly but still give you that nice vibrant sort of gel ink result. The industrial design team in Kalamazoo worked on the design of this pen. It was a lot of thought and a lot of process was put in place. Usability testing of the pens in various markets. A lot of energy went into this pen and it's been a great success. And you never really know that until you start selling it. We can do all the research you want, but at the end of the day, people have to get their wallet out and actually buy the thing for you to truly know it's been successful. And believe it or not, one of the ways that you can get that reinforcement at the end of the day is you take a look at Amazon. There's thousands and thousands of reviews. So even if a few of them are spurious or anomalies, the majority will give you good feedback. And this was one of my favorite quotes about this pen, that if we ever stop making it, the person will start crying. So maybe we've done a good thing there. I hope it's crying in the good way, that they want the pen not. Probably one of my final questions here before we wrap up and open for questions. Sharpie, of course, one of the iconic pens. I've spoken about that a few times during the meeting. Can anyone have a guess We make all the Sharpies in Maryville, Tennessee, at least all the ones that are in this form factor. And the black one alone, can anyone have a guess as to how many were made during the roughly 1 hour that I've been speaking, maybe just shy of 1 hour? Has anyone got an idea how many of those that have been made? Any guesses? 10? Any advance on 10? It is more than 10. A million is a great guess. I wish it was a million. We're talking in 1 hour, though. That would be fantastic. Yeah. Anyone else? Anyone closer to a million? Less than a million? 10,000? A bit more than 10,000? 20,000? 20,000 is the closest. It's actually a little more than 20,000. It's actually 42,000 pens in 1 hour, and that's just the black one, which is insane, if you ask me. So what are we doing with all those Sharpies, I ask you? I don't know. Not to mention that the Sharpie is actually mostly popular in North America. Elsewhere in the world, we really haven't sort of permeated those markets. So there's a lot of growth opportunity with Newell as well for the products to go beyond the borders here. But yeah, we make about 1 million of those per day is what's made, just of the black ones, which is incredible. And that's actually a quiet day, believe it or not. In a year, you can go up to about 500 million of just the black Sharpie. So I think if you rummage around at home, you'll probably find you have loads of them in the junk drawer at home or somewhere like that. So that's it for my presentation. Hopefully that gave you a brief insight into my journey and also the journey that Newell is going on. And I just wanted to open the floor for any questions, if anyone has any specifics. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, thank you.